Hello, everybody. Welcome. I see some people starting to file in. We're just going to give everybody a minute or so to get settled before we kind of dive headfirst into the exciting world of data and all the things that Mallory has prepared for you today. So in the meantime, why don't you kind of use the chat and pop in there and let us know where you are tuning in from and the name of your organization. I find everybody's always very shy. Once one person does it, then it snowballs.
I'm gonna do it. Hi, Lauren.
Here we go.
So good to see you here. Hi, Michael.
Oh, we've got somebody from Hamilton. We've got people from New Jersey, from Florida. I love when we get a good mix of, our American and Canadian friends all together.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, well, I think we will get this show on the road here. So thank you, everybody, again for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. My name is Meredith. I'm Keela's head of marketing. We also have Stephanie, our marketing specialist, helping us out today on the tech side of things. So you may see her in the chat box or answering some of your technical questions. So feel free to say hello to Steph. Before we get started, I just want to start the session today by acknowledging that Keela's head office is located in Vancouver, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. If you're new to Keela, welcome. Keela is a donor management and fundraising platform that helps you deepen donor engagement, centralize your data, and raise more for your cause, which is all very relevant to today's session. And today's session is going to be about 45 minutes in length, plus a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to write any questions that you have in the chat box or in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will be sure to get to as many of them as we can. And speaking of the chat box, please remember to select everyone when you type so that all of our guests today can read your comments and questions. And finally, the webinar is being recorded and you will receive access to the recording before the end of the week. Now, with all of that out of the way, I'm really excited to welcome our expert speaker for today, Mallory Erickson. Mallory is an executive coach, fundraising consultant, and host of the podcast, What the Fundraising, which is aimed at supporting nonprofit leaders to fundamentally change the way they lead and fundraise. Through her signature framework, the Power Partners Formula, Mallory provides unique tools to help nonprofits fundraise more from foundations, corporate partners, and individuals. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mallory.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the whole Keela team. I'm so excited to be talking to all of you guys about this today, and it also feels somewhat hilarious to be talking to all of you about this today because when I was an executive director, I avoided my donor database at all costs, and so we are going to talk about, from somebody who is not like a data person, how you can understand clean data, overcome the hurdles to data management to actually help you raise more, and I'm really excited. So no matter where you are on your tech literacy journey or wherever you are in terms of your data management journey, there's going to be something for everyone in here because I know what it's like to feel really overwhelmed by your data, by your donor database. And we had some great questions submitted in advance as well. So I even made a few changes this morning to make sure I'm answering everything I can. And then, of course, put questions in the chat. We'll have time at the end for that as well. Meredith already introduced me. I am Mallory Erickson, the creator of the Power Partners Formula, host of the podcast, What the Fundraising. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram, and there's my website as well. And if you haven't heard my story before, I became an accidental fundraiser, first actually as a managing director and then an executive director, and I hated fundraising. So in addition to my fear of my donor database, I was really overwhelmed with fundraising. And you can tell me in the chat, like, are you an accidental fundraiser too? How did you find yourself in that role? But I had dreams at first that fundraising was going to be this sort of easy thing. I was going to have donors coming to me. I wasn't going to be working more than 40 hours a week. The reality was quite different. And I always show this slide because this was what I call my impact report fake stage of life. And I was working like 10 to 15-hour days, totally scattered, didn't have a donor pipeline I trusted, didn't have a donor database that I trusted. And I felt this pressure to put up this appearance everywhere, like I had it all together, but it was a constant struggle. And I got to this moment in my career where I was like, I think I need to leave the nonprofit sector. I cannot get this fundraising thing to work for me. And I ended up having this sort of accidental fusion of life experiences. I got certified as an executive coach, trained in habit and behavior design and in design thinking. And those frameworks came together and fundamentally changed the way that I fundraised. And not only did it have huge impacts on my fundraising, like I moved an organization from $1 million to 3.8 pretty quickly. But more important than that was that I started to really enjoy fundraising. And so that's what led me to create what is now my signature program, the Power Partners Formula, which really combines all of these elements, executive coaching tools with modern fundraising strategy, habit and behavior design, and design thinking. And I love hearing, Catherine, that you are an accidental fundraiser too. The reason I'm sharing this framework with you right now is because this training today is inspired by all of these different frameworks and all these different principles. So we're going to be talking about data management, more than just some like listicle of all the data management practices you should be using. We're going to be talking about data management, both from a practical, logistical standpoint. We're going to be talking about it in terms of the resistance a lot of us experience around our data and why and how we overcome them, and then how we design habits. Because data management, when it comes down to it, data management is really about a series of habits, things that we do over and over and over again, and how we actually build habits within ourselves, within our teams, because it's not this one-time thing, right? Data management, clean data is not like this one-time checkbox. It is a long-term process. And so helping you understand how designing habits work and help you actually design a habit around your data management is going to help you be able to leave this webinar with tactical, practical tools to implement right away. Okay, so let's talk about, I have 5 tips that I'm going to go through with you today that sort of surround this whole framework. So one of the questions I get a lot is what data should we be collecting? Okay. This question, there is no like fully universal answer to this question, although I'm going to give you kind of the hierarchy of the types of data you should be collecting. But the very first thing in your data collection process is actually to take a step back and ask yourself to define your need for data in the first place. Okay. Donor data is only as important as we are able to use it. Okay. The data alone is not valuable. What's valuable are the insights and information that we gain from the data. So the very first thing to ask yourself is, what data is valuable to us? Why do we want to be collecting data in the first place? What do we want to know about our donors? How are we able to hold that information about our donors, right? And making sure those things match, right? Because you don't want to be saying, oh, well, I want to know every detail about what my donors did, last summer in terms of our programming, but then you have no way to actually capture or categorize that data, okay? So asking yourself these questions, like what's the most important data you can be collecting for your nonprofit that you can be using for your nonprofit as well? And this is going to be different for everyone. And I thought it might, before I go through kind of the lists of types of data that you can be collecting, I thought it might be helpful to just like orient you to like what your donors want in the first place. So in all of your communications with your donors, in all of your relationship building with your donors are consistently looking for, connection to their personal identity. And I'm going to explain how these pieces relate directly to your data in a moment, right? But they're looking for connection to their personal identity, sense of belonging to the right group, okay? Belief that their involvement matters, and then positive memories with your organization. So what's important about understanding these things, like what are donors looking for in relationship to your organization, is that your data and your use of data impacts this tremendously, right? Think about this for a second. How does your data help connect to a person's personal identity? Knowing their first name, for example, allows you to personalize an email, right? You can do the hi first name, and that allows you to personalize an email to a person. How does your data support a sense of belonging to the right group? Well, let's say you are leading an LGBTQIA organization, and having pronouns in your donor database is incredibly important. And so, because that really impacts people's sense of belonging to the right organization, giving to the right organization that's living out the values and the work that they're doing. Okay, so your data impacts your donor's sense of belonging. Belief that their involvement matters. Let's think about what kind of data impacts a donor's belief that their involvement matters. Their giving data, right? Knowing when somebody gave, how much they gave, and what they gave to allows you to give feedback on the impact of their gift, allows you to give feedback around how much they gave, a thank you with a personalization of how much they gave, really reinforces belief that their involvement matters. And then positive memories with the organization. Positive memories with an organization can be everything from like coming to a gala where they have this really monumental memory, but it can also be feeling good in communication with you, like you know who they are, right? We've all probably had experiences, and like we're going to talk about perfectionism later in this webinar, so I don't want anyone to get too worried right now, because mistakes in data happen, and clean data does not mean perfect data, but we all know what it's like to get consistent communication that feels really misaligned with who we are. And we're like, this organization, this person, like they don't know me and they're not trying to get to know me better. And that is not creating a positive memory between me and this organization. So I want to just orient you all to like, why does data matter? How does the data impact the way in which we build relationships with our donors? Okay. So now I am going to give you a quick listicle, okay, around what data should you be collecting and why. So here is from order of what I would say like most important. And I don't want to say least important, because feedback is obviously important data to be collecting, but like if you are on ground zero and you are like, we are about to fundraise for the very first time, or we're starting our nonprofit for the very first time, everything about data management is the relationship between your capacity, and that's both your capacity in terms of your time as an organization to manage your data, your software capacity, right? And being honest about those things. So the very first most important thing is contact information, right? Because without that basic data, you can't communicate with your donors or acknowledge their contributions. Donation history is the second most important thing, right? Understanding a donor's giving patterns and history is crucial for predicting future donations and maybe planning fundraising strategies. Contact preferences. So that's like asking a donor, do you prefer to get information via phone or text or mail? Now, I want to say something about this. One of the most important things with contact preferences is people who say, please do not contact me, okay? So if you are only communicating with your donors via email, then it might not make sense for you to collect a lot of information about their contact preferences related to direct mail and text messages, because you don't use those. Could it be helpful in the future? Yeah, maybe, but it's not high priority. But what would be high priority for you is understanding if they don't want to be contacted at all. Okay, so that's the really, really important part about contact preferences. Okay, and then engagement history, right? This data provides valuable insight into the donor's level of involvement. Demographic information, this is a broad data category, but it can help you tailor your fundraising strategies to characteristics of your donor, like where they live. Let's say you're having an event in a particular location or something like that. And then psychographic information or philanthropic preferences, this helps you build deeper connection. Their capacity to give be really important information so that you're asking them for a donation that's within their ability. Their connections and relationships in the community, kind of understanding that web and network, and then feedback, right? Getting feedback from your donors. But again, you only want to ask for data that you have the capacity to collect and maintain. And as you scale up your data, as you scale up your relationships, you can scale up your data collection as you build relationships with donors. So we got a great pre-question about how do I ask for donor data without being sort of intrusive and overstepping? And one of the big pieces for that is like, okay, so maybe you don't ask them like 45 questions before they give a first donation, right? We'll talk about this in the habit design section. But when people are first building a relationship with you, you don't want to create barriers to entry, right? That's a lot of times on donation forms, we just see name and email address and their ability to give. They can make a donation right there without giving a ton of personal information. That's really helpful. And then you can scale up your data collection. You can ask them more questions as you deepen your relationship with that donor over time. Okay. One of the things that we also got in a pre-question that I'm not going to go into detail about this, but you guys can screenshot this. I'm happy to give you the slides later. But if you're transitioning your donor database for the first time, or you are setting up your donor database for the first time, one of the most important things at whatever scale you're at, is to set data collection rules and document it somewhere. So have a master document around how you are going to collect certain data points that have variation to them. This might seem so silly and simple, but it makes a huge difference. So deciding as an organization, do you categorize everyone by their formal name, or do you allow it to put people's nicknames in there? Okay, because this can impact duplicate records and searching and things like that. Do you use salutations and how? Do you use pronouns and how? Or do you abbreviate certain things? How do you put data in? Okay. And you can Google this very simply online, and Keela might have a great resource for this too, but just to figure out all of the decisions around how you actually collect your data, and then having that in one place, kind of like a key, so that everybody's using the same thing. Another webinar question that we got is like, we have a lot of people using the database from a lot of different departments. So how do we keep it all clean? This is one of the big ways to do it, to have data collection rules and document it. And the other thing I would say to answer that question, just while I'm on it, is to make sure that you're clear about who's actually entering which types of data. Like, just because a lot of different departments are using the donor database to pull out certain information, like maybe one department is seeing donors in a volunteer capacity and another department is seeing volunteers in their fundraising capacity. That doesn't mean that everyone should be inputting all different types of data. Like, one person is probably managing addresses, phone numbers, like the core data. And then it could mean that different departments are allowed to add notes to the data, but really you should have sort of a core operational function that's managing the core data of your donors. So not everyone's going in and updating addresses and things like that. Okay, that was a lot in tip 1. So let's move on to tip 2. So one of the things I told you we're going to talk about perfectionism, but before we talk about perfectionism, we need to talk about resistance to data, okay? Because one of the foundational principles in the work that I do, executive coaching work, is around the relationship between how our thoughts and our beliefs impact how we feel, and then ultimately how we show up, and that impacts our results, okay? So our thoughts and our beliefs impact how we feel, and then ultimately how we show up or don't show up, and our results. So when I say data, or when I say donor database, your whole stomach drops. The first thing I want you to think about in your head is, okay, what are some of the thoughts and the beliefs that I hold about our data that makes me so uncomfortable thinking about logging into our donor database, right? Or why am I avoiding our data in that certain area? What are the thoughts and the beliefs that I'm holding about that? And that could be things like, oh, my data will never be clean enough, or there's so many mistakes in our data, I don't even want to look at it, or I know we have a lot of duplicate records in there and I have no idea where to start, okay? And we're going to talk about where to start in a moment. But the very first piece of this puzzle is really just to have awareness and have some honesty around why your data or why your donor database might be making you uncomfortable in the first place, because that's going to be really illuminating, and that's going to help guide where your data hygiene, where your data cleaning practices likely need to start, okay? A lot of folks here have probably had multiple ways of collecting data over the years, especially if you're an organization that's been around for 20, 10, 5 years even, okay? You might have collected data initially on sheets of paper, at certain events that then went into Excel documents that then maybe went into a donor platform at one point, and now you're switching finally to a full CRM system, right? Data transitions happen. And at each transition point, like there likely is some issue around or some imperfections around the data. That's okay. There's a difference between clean data and perfect data, or usable data and perfect data, but we have to bring some awareness to why we're so resistant, why we're avoiding our data in the first place. The reason why this is so important is because you can create like a clean data management strategy. You can walk away with all these different habits that we talk about, but if you have limiting beliefs about your data, like unless my data is perfect, I don't want to use it at all, then you're not actually going to use the strategy that you put together. Okay. So it's so important to be honest with yourselves, to be honest with your team, to have this actual conversation around what are some of the limiting beliefs we hold about our data that holds us back from actually even using our CRM system or collecting other data or cleaning this in incremental steps. Okay. One of the things that helps us get over the resistance that we feel to things like this, things that feel overwhelming, things that feel scary, is using habit and behavior design. Okay. So I want to teach you actually how to design a habit, and then we're going to have you pick a data cleaning behavior or data hygiene behavior that you want to try to create a habit around. Okay. So for any action to take place, right? A habit is just a repeatable action, like an action that is repeated in a consistent way. So for any action to take place, 3 things need to come together: enough motivation to take that action, the ability to take that action, and being prompted to take that action. Okay. And this happens on a spectrum. So I studied under Dr. BJ Fogg. He's out of Stanford, and he has created the Fogg behavior model, which I think is the most helpful framework for understanding how to design habits, design behaviors for you, for your team, and frankly, for your donors too. But that's a whole different talk. So again, in order for us to take any action, so let's say that action is logging into your donor database. Let's take a simple action, okay? You need to have enough motivation to want to log in. You need to have the ability to log in, and you need to be prompted to log in. So let me just explain these to you. So motivation is like believing that by logging into your donor database, you're going to find valuable information. Believing that by logging into your donor database and logging information about a donor, it's going to help someone else, right? Hope, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but hope drives motivation up, fear drives motivation down, right? So motivation is kind of like what we believe about the purpose of doing that. How motivated do we feel to actually take that action? Now, you could be so motivated around your donor database. Like, I know, this gives me all the most valuable information. And I know it's so helpful to my whole team. I'm totally, totally motivated. But if you don't have a login to that donor database, then you're not getting over the action line because you don't have the ability to do it. So no matter how high our motivation is, if we do not have the ability to take the action, we will not take the action. So ability can be anything from having the login information to actually do it, the time to actually do it, and understanding what is the difference between actual time and perception of time. That's a whole different thing, but having the time to be able to log in, having the computer, the technical capability to be able to log in. Does your software work on your computer? Does it work correctly on your computer? All those things impact ability. Do I know how to log this information correctly? And then prompts are reminders to take the action. So over time, when we build a habit, the prompts can start to happen more organically, like right after you finish a donor meeting, that's your prompt to log into your donor database. But when you start to build habits for the very first time, you often have to create prompts. Those can be calendar reminders. They could be accountability inside your team meetings, okay? But we do not take action without prompts. People do not take action without prompts, okay? So when you're creating data management habits, the very first thing I want you to think about is, how can I make this action as easy as possible to do? Okay, how can I make this action as easy as possible to do? So if you are trying to get someone on your team to more regularly, let's say, log the mail that's returned to sender mail that's coming into your office. You don't feel like addresses are being updated frequently enough. Okay, so what's one way you could make that action easier to do? One thing you could do is put a meeting time on the calendar every week where that is always happening, right? And maybe 3 people sit around together and they update addresses, or you put it on one person's calendar and you make sure that time is really sacred. You want to make the action as easy as possible to do. But sometimes, particularly when it comes to data management, the ease is not enough, because sometimes we have a lot of resistance around our data and our data management. We're very afraid of what we're going to see inside there. And so this is what I was mentioning before, to recognize in terms of motivation that hope drives motivation up and fear drives motivation down. So sometimes when it comes to designing habits for data management, we need to be honest about, okay, what fears are holding us back from actually taking that action? And we need to address that fear, and we need to increase hope inside ourselves and inside our teams around what might be possible if we start to take that data management habit. Okay, so I want you to pick inside your mind one data point that you want to collect or improve. I'm going to walk you through the steps of how you would do this using the habit and behavior design that I just showed you. Okay, so I want you to pick one data point that you want to collect or improve inside your database. And if you want to share what those are in the chat, you can let us know. But one data point you want to collect or improve inside your organization. Okay. And then here are the steps to start to improve that. So number 1, think about, usually when we think about data collection, data management, we think about the entire process, or like the end of the process. So think about what the steps are to that collection or that improvement, okay? And maybe you're able to think about all the steps. Maybe there are just a few steps that come out for you right away, but think about, what are all the steps for that collection or improvement? It might be getting a donor database so we can put that form on our website, or adding a field when we're collecting that data for pronouns, because currently we're not collecting that. So we need to set that up as a custom field inside our donor database. That's step 1, right? And then step 2 might be putting that onto the form. And then step 3 might be putting that onto the website, okay? But the thing I want you to do, you don't need to know all the steps. You need to identify what is the very, 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 very first step, just the very first step. And then I want you to put a prompt in place. You can go open your calendar right now. I want you to put a prompt in place to remind you to take that very first step after this webinar, okay? And maybe think for a second about, okay, you might experience some resistance around that when you go to take that action. So how can you decrease fear in that moment and increase action and increase hope just to take that very, very first step? The idea behind habit and behavior design is that momentum plays a really big role. So we want to get you over the action line, just piece by piece by piece. And there's a story BJ Fogg tells in his book about somebody who wanted to start having a morning, wanted to start to eat breakfast in the morning. And she was really struggling to create a habit around eating breakfast in the morning. The first part of the habit that she designed was she wanted to start eating oatmeal, was to put a pot on the stove. That was the first step. That's all she had to do at first. Put the pot on the stove. Okay. Then the second step was fill the pot with water and put the pot on the stove. Okay. And then she built that habit. Then the third step was fill the pot with water, put it on the stove, turn on the stove. Okay. So this is how tiny habits are actually created over time. And you might be sitting here and be like, oh my God, Mallory, like, we don't have time for this. Like, we just got to do like the whole thing at once. But let me tell you, that mindset is actually what holds us back from doing any of it. Okay. We don't do any of it because we're like, oh my gosh, there's 45 steps to fix this process. So I want you to think about what is one data point you want to improve? One. What is the very first step to improving that? add a prompt to your calendar when you're going to do that one thing, okay? And then after you finish that one thing, just identify the next thing and add that prompt to your calendar, piece by piece by piece. And you can do this with each data point you want to improve. And over time, which we're going to talk about in tip 3, that is how you clean your data, okay? Because if you are waiting, you guys, for the week where you have 30 hours to focus on cleaning your donor database, you will never do it. You will never do it. So we have to think about this in terms of continuous improvement, not perfection, okay? Because nothing kills data collection like perfectionism. Perfectionism around having all of the time that you need to make that data perfect, and perfectionism around the data itself. You know, one of the reasons, so last week on What the Fundraising, I did this mini series with Keela. It was incredible. I interviewed 3 different experts around data collection, data equity, perfectionism. One of the things that's so clear to me is, like, we talk so much in this sector about clean data, but what is clean data? Like, what is clean data? Can you define clean data? And how do you know when your data is clean enough? I think that in this sector, we have actually swapped clean data for perfect data, or we've made them mean the same things. And because our data never feels perfect, because our data is never going to be perfect, we just have this constant feeling that our data isn't clean enough. And then we are afraid to interact with it, to use it, to touch it, because we just have this like resistance to, oh my gosh, our data has so many problems with it. Can you tell me in the chat, you guys, does this feel true for you too? This was so true for me as an executive director. And I want to know if this is resonating with all of you too, okay? So this piece around perfectionism is so important, because the thing about perfectionism is that it cannot actually be solved in your donor database. Oh my gosh, you guys, this is the truth, okay? If you think clean data equals perfect data, that is not going to be solved in your donor database, because their perfection is an illusion, okay? And so perfectionism has to be addressed in your mind. Like, it has to be addressed inside of you, not inside the database, because you'll just keep setting that goalpost farther and farther and farther. Our perfectionist tendencies, they lead to a feel of failure, a lack of adaptability, decreased motivation, so we are way less likely to get over the action line, and a lack of collaboration. All things that really hurt our data hygiene and data collection. So we need to be honest with ourselves, with our teams, around where is perfectionism getting in the way of us actually using the data that we do have, right? And being okay to say, okay, you know what? We know not everyone's, hold on, I'm not going to skip ahead yet. We know not everyone's first name is correct in our system. We know sometimes when people have given a donation or entered a lead magnet, they have put a letter for their first name, okay? This is true in my database, okay? I send emails all the time. Every single one personalizes the person's first name as they entered it into their database. Did some people put gag names when they entered it? Absolutely. Did some people put no name? Absolutely. Did some people put a 1-letter thing? Absolutely. So does that mean that everybody's first name is perfect when it arrives in their email inbox? Absolutely not. But does that mean I shouldn't be using personalization in my email? No way. Okay. And that is where perfectionism really gets in our way. Okay. So here's some ways to address perfectionist tendencies when it comes to your data in particular. One is to create your own data benchmarks. So the first thing is to identify what data are you trying to collect in the first place and why, and what does good enough data look like for that? Actually define that. What does that look like for you? And good enough data is usable data, okay, right? The second thing is set realistic expectations. Okay, so I told you the reason I scaled that list of data to collect at the beginning is because if you are a brand new organization, if you are keeping track of your donor data on Post-it notes or Excel documents, then let's not start collecting psychographic data about our donors yet, right? Let's set realistic expectations based on our capacity, both our time capacity, our software capacity. That is so important. Make the actions and behaviors smaller. If you have been trying to wait for, again, the time when you have 40 hours to clean your donor database, that is really hard to get over the action line around, okay? So how can you make some of your data hygiene actions, some of your data feedback actions smaller and the behaviors smaller, okay? If you are doing this or your team is doing this, track the progress of the behaviors instead of the outcomes. Okay, this is a mistake we make in fundraising a lot. We only celebrate the outcomes of our fundraising instead of the behaviors, sending out that email, having the meeting, making the phone call. The same thing is true for data hygiene, okay? If you're waiting to celebrate until you feel like your database is ready or perfect, right? Then there's not going to be any feedback loop that's really important to cementing those habits. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute as well. So you want to track the progress of behaviors. Celebrate every time your staff logs into your CRM system. Celebrate every time your staff updates something. Every time somebody fixes a mail issue, right? You get a return to sender. Like, make sure that your team is tracking and celebrating the data hygiene behaviors that you're doing, not just this like gold standard of perfect data that you have sort of put up on the pedestal over there. Okay. This also comes down to culture, creating a culture of feedback and learning. Again, knowing that things are not going to be perfect, but it does not mean you should not be using that data. Also, people are incredibly like gracious and forgiving. And so anytime like I've been using data where I'm like, I feel like I'm probably missing some historic giving data in here, but I really want to talk about this person's lifetime giving, I will say that in the email. And I've been able to do this with mass email too, right? You put people's lifetime giving and you say, you know, we have done a data transition over the last few years. If you feel like something's missing from here, please let me know, because of course I want all of your generosity tracked inside our database. Okay. So you can be honest, you can be vulnerable, you can be open about those things and still use the data that you have. Okay. And then again, celebrate failure and feedback. This is a really cool thing that Tim Lockey says on the podcast interview last week. He's the creator of the Human Stack and just like a data genius. And one of the things that he said was like, when people complain about data or they complain about a system, it's actually a good sign. It means they are committed to improving it. And that's really valuable. They're committed to doing better in that way, both when that's happening internally inside our staff, but also with our donors. And so we don't need to be afraid of that. Getting that feedback, getting that responsiveness, getting actually you guys are missing this thing, that's great. They want to make sure you have the best data available, and mistakes happen. And people really are much more gracious than we give them credit for. And a big piece of this is demonstrating self-compassion, right? Knowing that things are going to happen. You are improving as you go along. Perfection is an illusion. Okay. These are all really important elements of addressing perfectionist tendencies when it comes to data management. Okay. The other thing I want to say, that the fourth tip I want to give around data management is around prioritizing connection and celebration. I started to hint at this in the last tip, but our nervous systems, a lot of when we are avoiding things, resisting things, it's because our nervous system is activated. We're in like a fight or flight mode, okay? And our databases often bring our nervous system into some of those zones. So one of the things that can actually downregulate our nervous system is when we experience safe and genuine connection. And I think the reason why this is so important to bring up when it comes to data management is because so often data management is happening in silos when we're all alone. And so we are feeling really isolated and really alone when we're in that state of overwhelm in our nervous system. And so the more you can bring people into connection and celebration together, your team, doing things together during a team meeting, being on Zoom while you're all doing something in your database at the same time, creating that connection is actually going to create a lot more safety in people's interaction with the software. And then this is what I talked about before as well, which is that habits are cemented. So all of those things we talked about, motivation, ability, prompt, okay? And then the habit is that behavior repeated over time. one of the things that really helps with the repetition of that behavior over time is celebration of the behavior instead of the outcome. So I've sort of combined these things for some recommendations around how you both create that connection on your team around data and how you celebrate the actions. So the first part of this is identify the actions that you want your teams to be taking. And this goes back to the first steps, right? Make the action easier to do. Identify some of those first step data management habits that you want people to be taking, and identify those as actions that you want your team to be taking. Prioritize those actions. So please do not leave this webinar and go to your team and be like, we have 25 new data management habits that I want everybody to start doing immediately. Okay, prioritize the data management, data hygiene actions that you want your teams to be taking based on the data that is the most valuable, useful, and important for your specific organization. And then decide how you're going to celebrate each time somebody does that action, takes that action. Okay, not outcomes, action. And then I would use team meetings if you're on a team to check in on action totals and confirm that the action itself was celebrated. This is how you create repeatable habits. This is how you create momentum around your data management, data hygiene practices. Okay, tip 5. This might seem a little bit like random, but one of the questions, a lot of people ask questions before the webinar today. This is what I switched up this morning around how do you make tech decisions in general, or how do you figure out like what technology you use? How do you manage up around technology? How do you make decisions based on price? And so I want to share a framework with all of you that I think is really helpful around how you make decisions about impact over cost and how to get out of the scarcity mindset a little bit around tech decisions. Because one of the places we see scarcity mindset show up in a big way is really around tech decisions. And I was 100% guilty of this as nonprofit ED. I was like, what's the cheapest option, right? Like, what's the cheapest option? I know that's what my board is going to ask me about. And so that's how I looked at tech decisions. And now what I realize is how many opportunities and how much support I was missing, looking always for the free solution or making decisions based on cost alone. And I'm not saying that cost is not an important factor to consider, and everybody has different budgets. I totally get that. But I want to give you a framework for thinking about this, right? Because a scarcity mindset in purchasing decisions, first of all, doesn't feel good when you've made that purchasing decision, okay? It doesn't feel good to feel like you're settling for the thing that you don't really want, but it was the cheapest thing, okay? That is never, so like you might ultimately go with the cheapest solution on the market or a free solution on the market. That's totally fine, but you don't want that to be the reason why you've chosen it, because that decision is never going to feel good. And you're not starting off on a great foot thinking you're going to log into that a lot of the time, because you kind of just feel like, oh, well, I rationalized my way into this. Okay. So the first thing is to just sort of be aware of the way that scarcity mindset is playing into some of that decision making. The second thing here is to think about the behavior model that I showed you before and around hope, bringing in hope as your decision making. So a lot of time when we're making tech decisions, we're thinking about the loss aversion of the money that we're spending, okay? But what we want to be thinking about is what will be possible when we have that technology in place. What will be possible when we have that technology in place? And what would be possible if we had technology that did X, Y, or Z, or software that did X, Y, or Z? That is the way to be thinking more consciously about what you actually want versus what you're settling for. We don't want your tech decisions to be reactive. We want them to be proactive, okay? And so one of the frameworks that I use to really help with this is what I call your fundraising ROI, okay? Your hourly fundraising ROI. So this is something that I use to help me and my clients make decisions around their investment in different types of tools, okay? So you think about, how much you raise annually, for example, how many hours you spend on fundraising per year, and you get your hourly fundraising ROI, okay? So if you raise $1 million a year, and you fundraise 30 hours a week over, let's say, 47 weeks a year, it's 1,410 hours of fundraising. You're raising about $709 on average per hour of fundraising. Now, some hours of fundraising, you might be raising $5,000. Some hours of fundraising, you might be raising $21, but it averages out. Okay, this just gives you an idea of how valuable your time is. Okay. So then when I think about with a certain tech tool, like if I'm like, okay, if I have this tech tool, I'm actually going to be able to spend 10 hours a week less on fundraising because this tech tool does X, Y, and Z, or because I'm not migrating these Excel sheets together, or because I'm not having to check all these different databases because it's all in one platform. Okay. So you think about the impact that that tech tool will have on your hours of fundraising. And then that changes your fundraising ROI. Okay. So you think about this, here's a tech tool that's saving this organization 10 hours a week in fundraising. And now they're raising over $1,000 per hour of fundraising. So what they could do is continue to fundraise 30 hours a week, but at that ROI, they're going to raise a lot more money. And so when you think about what a tech tool can empower you to do, you want to think about the potential for that, the potential. If 10 hours a week of my time were freed up from data management in all these different broken systems, and I could actually spend 10 hours more a week reaching out to people, setting up meetings, going and speaking on panels where I could attract new donors, right? That time you're going to raise a lot more money and you're going to easily pay for that tech tool. So this is a tool that can help pull you out of scarcity mindset, help you think about the hope of what a tech tool can really provide. And you can use this when you're managing up with your boss or your board and trying to get other people on board around the importance of making investments like this. Okay. I told y'all we would have time for questions at the end. I've been seeing things coming through on the chat, and I'm sure Steph or Meredith are going to come on to help me. If you are interested, if we are not connected, you're interested in connecting with me or other fundraisers like you, I have a free community, the whatthefundraisingcommunity.com. You can go there, you can join today. And it's just an incredible group of fundraisers sharing resources. And all the times I speak and everything like that are always posted there as well. And you can connect with me. Again, there's my website, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I'd love to connect with you. If you have questions that pop up later too, like don't hesitate to reach out. I'll send you a voice memo back or something. I know not everybody is processing in like the hour that we have together. So if you're laying there later tonight and you're like, oh, like what about this thing? Like feel free to shoot me a message. I'm always happy to answer them.
Wow, that was a lot of information and so good. I think, I also come from, fundraising background, and I've heard every which excuse to not clean up our data. I've heard, stories don't live in data. I've heard all these different things. And I think when we think about it in the ways that it can help us, it makes it so much more clear that there's work to be done, and it's important work. We got a whole bunch of questions come in, so I think we should get going on them. So okay. The first one we got was from Anjali, and she says, so a challenge that her organization is having is that most donor data is delayed or limited, and that's because it's coming from third-party processors. So do you have any tips for kind of how you can manage your data when maybe it's not entering your database from your own team?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think in terms of the delay, I don't know how much of a delay we're talking about. Like we're talking about Facebook fundraising. I think one thing is to recognize, like, if you feel like using Facebook fundraisers, for example, like isn't serving your organization anymore because you want to be in more communication with your donors, that's when it's really time, I think, to think about switching solutions. Like just because a tech solution like that has worked for you for a certain amount of time doesn't mean it's supposed to be the one that scales with your organization. So I think like one piece of it is knowing that, like, okay, so think about the data you are getting from that third-party software. Think about the timeline that you usually get that data in, and then create some systems and processes around that. And maybe if it is coming from like a Facebook fundraiser thing, your email outreach is like, we just got the news from Facebook that you contributed to X, Y, and Z back in blank, and we were so excited to see your name pop up, all those things. any third-party software that's not giving you addresses, email addresses, all of those things, that can be really hard. I've seen organizations create systems of, Facebook messaging people who have given and stuff like that, much harder to track, definitely. And so I think like create whatever systems you can around the data you are getting and how. And then I think at a point where it's creating a lot of pain and friction and lack of autonomy in your organization to really like own and manage your data, that might be where it's time to move off of Facebook fundraisers and onto your own platforms to run campaigns.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I know at Keela, we hear a lot about, these data coming in from all these different places, whether it's through Facebook, like you said, or Benevity or United Way, and all these places that it could be coming in. So that's a great tip.
Yeah.
We have a question from Jeff. So Jeff is asking, how far back should we keep our donor data, especially those who are no longer donating?
I think this really depends on what the capability of your software is. Like, I think, there's a difference between keeping your donor data and like actively soliciting to donor data that has, gone stale, for example. So like if somebody hasn't given to an organization in 5 years, I am likely not going to recommend that the organization spends their money on direct mail to that donor. But do I think they should delete the donor data from their system? Not necessarily, as long as their system has the capacity to hold that data. I mean, especially I would say over the last 3 years with what we've seen with COVID and the impact it's had on lapsed donors returning, but then some of them leaving again, like donor data is a little bit wonkier than usual, I would say. And so I would retain it for as long as you have the capacity to retain it, because we do sometimes see donors come back a lot later, especially if they're smaller donations and they might not be something that the donor remembers like from the past, but then they come to a gala. Like, how cool to be able to say, hey, like, do you know 5 years ago, actually, you did blank, blank, blank. It's so amazing to see you again. And when we can have those touch points and remember those things, it can be really valuable. So I think as long as it's not hurting you, costing you a ton of money, or super stressful, I keep it for as long as I can.
Amazing. Okay, we got a question from Michael, and he's asking, what common elements are collected that aren't helpful or should be cleaned or removed from a database to prevent roadblocks or speed bumps in future fundraising?
Ooh. That's a really good question. I mean, I think this looks, and Meredith, maybe you have an answer here that you want to chime in around. I mean, I think the main thing here is like, if you've created a custom field 5 years ago that does not apply to your organization anymore, and that is making the data feel wonky, okay, then I think it's more about figuring out like how that data is actually impacting your ability to pull other data. So I think like the roadblock piece just looks really different for everyone. So I don't know, like, I mean, I would say like cleaned, one of the things that's really helped that I see a lot of organizations want to prioritize in terms of cleaning their data is like soft credit data, which could probably be like a whole other webinar, right? But just sort of making sure that, records are tied together. Sometimes you have donations that are made through an individual. Sometimes that comes in through a family foundation. Sometimes it comes in through like a Fidelity trust, charitable trust. And those end up creating 3 different records in your database, but then it can look like sometimes somebody didn't give this year who actually did give, but they gave through a different vehicle. So one of the biggest priorities, I would say, especially before end of year, before you might be making phone calls or direct solicitations to your major donors, like I would make sure that you're sort of like soft credit and reconciliation of some of those things are prioritized. And then, cleaned, obviously addresses, especially if you do direct mail, like you can do like address checks, and before you spend a lot of money on stamps and direct mail, I would really highly recommend like doing some like address checking like that. For some organizations that do a lot of email email fundraising. There are also a lot of tools to clean your email database in terms of deliverability and spam and things like that, like how to just sort of run your database through some tools to flag email addresses that are, wrong or incorrect or fake, that ultimately impact your email deliverability. So I think the first thing is to identify, like, what is your primary vehicle of fundraising? What's the data that feels like the biggest roadblock to you to being able to fundraise in that way? And then what is one way to, again, make it small? What would be the first step in improving that data?
Yeah, I was, when you were saying this, I don't know that there is one answer, right?
Yeah.
It can be different for depending on your organization. And we hear this from our clients as well sometimes. And, it's important to kind of sit down with your fundraising team and understand what you're using this data for. I think, different teams are going to have different needs. And once you're kind of on the same page about how all of your teams need to use this data, what information is important to each team, then you can look at maybe some of the things that you can clean up a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a question from Victoria that says, how do we handle things when we have two data systems we're working on at once? Ideally, we'd like to have one, but we keep waiting until we have a better handle on the data and how we want to organize and use it. I feel like we're duplicating work for our staff, but is it better to keep it when we're working on building up good habits?
Oh, okay. Well, Victoria, there are like a number of questions that I want to ask you before fully answering this question, but I would think about how much I would use the ROI calculator that I sent you around, like, how much time are you spending because you're in two platforms, and like how much time would it save to be in one platform, and how does that impact your fundraising ROI over time? And I love that I need to check out Keela's calculator as well that they threw in the chat. But I would think about like that in terms of like, if you're duplicating a lot of work that is 2 or 3 or 5 hours a week, I think, it's probably time now. And truthfully, a lot of times when I hear folks say, we'll be ready when, a lot of times that is just a lot of resistance and fear. And likely you're going to keep kicking that can because you're going to never feel like your habits are good enough or your data is good enough. And so I just find that I'm just being really like honest. I hope this doesn't feel too much like a gut punch, but I think I see that narrative a lot, and I used that narrative a lot in my own leadership when really I was never going to give myself permission to take that leap. And so this is causing a lot of friction, a lot of pain, a lot of redundancy inside your organization. I say merge it, get it done, build the habits in the new system. Yeah, that's my recommendation.
Yeah, and ties so nicely back into what you said about like, let's stop chasing perfection. Like, it's never going to happen. Let's just do it and then, move forward, right?
Yeah, things are imperfect. That's okay, and I think like when we just think, that's why when Meredith and I were talking about doing this like series on the podcast and this webinar in the first place, I was like, I think we have equated clean data with perfect data, and everybody is dissatisfied and not engaging with their data because they think there's this like mystery clean data mountain that other organizations are on. Nobody's on it. Everybody's data has problems. There's no perfect clean mountain. Like it doesn't exist. So like, we just need to like dispel that myth and say, everybody on this webinar, you have valuable data. You have data inside your database that you can and should be using right now. Use what you can, identify what matters, slowly clean the things that are not working for you. But use it. And you know what? Some of the best ways to find your issues, using it. Like getting that feedback. And so if you're like, oh, I don't even know what's broken, cool, then just start using it and you'll figure out what's broken. And so like, that's the only way that we can actually get better.
Yeah. And it's so like not just a nonprofit issue either. Like the most established companies in the world, Google, Facebook, none of them have clean data. Like that's not a secret, right? They're doing the best with what they've got and making small steps to improve it every day. So that's where we're all kind of starting in the same pot here and working on it together.
Yeah.
So we have 1 minute left. So I just want to ask one more question before we kind of close it out. But if you were to kind of give one thing from your presentation today that you would recommend everybody on this call takes back to their team and shares, what would it be?
I would take that slide about what is the first step of cleaning your most important data point. What is the first step of cleaning your most important data point? Put a prompt on your calendar, do that one thing. Like, you have to prove to yourself that you can do this, like that you can show up for yourself, that you can take an action in order to demonstrate that you can continue to take these steps forward. So pick the first step of cleaning your most important data point for your organization, put a prompt on your calendar to take that step, just the first step. That's my number one takeaway.
Amazing. I feel like this could be a 3-hour webinar.
I know,
I
packed a lot in there. I packed a lot in there, but I felt like there's so many pieces to this, right? There's like the strategy and the elements of data collection, but then there's all the stuff that gets in the way of doing that. And so I wanted to make sure that you guys had those frameworks so you could take the logistics and actually apply them.
Yes, for sure. It's all so important, all part of the process. But we are at time, so we are going to have to wrap it up, and that concludes our session today. But thank you so much again, Mallory. I hope everybody leaves today feeling empowered to use their data, to get started, to do kind of something to move you towards becoming a little bit more data driven as an organization. So thank you. Before we go, I just want to let everyone know that there will be a very short survey that will pop up right after the session. Should only take you about 20 seconds, but we would greatly appreciate hearing your feedback. We also have our next webinar coming out next Tuesday, May 30th, called Introduction to Prospect Research with Celine Herr from the YMCA of Greater Toronto. And Steph will leave a link to register for that webinar in the chat if you are interested. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Mallory, and I hope to see everybody at the next Key Labs webinar. Bye, everybody.